Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this Axiomatics webinar, Proving Compliance Through the Attribute-Based Access Control Lifecycle. As many of you know, Axiomatics is a leader in dynamic authorization solutions and helps enterprises and government agencies adopt a policy-based approach to access control. So a few notes before we get started. You are all centrally muted. We'll also be recording today's session so you can view it and share it after the event. We'll make sure you all get a link to the recording by email for easy access. We also hope you've come armed with a few questions on this topic. We'll be taking open questions at the end. You can submit your questions at any time. So again, welcome to today's session on proving compliance through the attribute-based access control lifecycle. I'd like to introduce our speakers, Srijit Nair and Brian Kolaluka. First, Srijit, as the product manager at Axiomatics, he is responsible for the vision, planning, and design around the core products of Axiomatics. His background includes virtualization and the cloud-based delivery model, as well as advanced studies on information flow control, policy enforcement, applied cryptography, and general system security. So welcome, Srijit. We also have Brian Kolaluka, a new addition to the Axiomatics team. He's joined us as a technical sales engineer. And most recently, Brian was in the federal government space where he managed operational authorization systems. He's located in Northern Virginia as part of our federal team, where he provides pre-sales engineering support. So welcome to you both. And with that, I'll turn it over to you guys to get us started.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly. This is Brian Kolaluka. Great introduction. So today on our agenda, we're going to talk about briefly what is attribute-based access control, the new model, post-role-based access control. We're going to talk about Axiomatics and how we implement ABAC. We're going to talk about the need for auditing and meeting compliance standards and regulations and how ABAC drives those needs or meets those needs. And we're going to discuss two tools that we have to provide solutions for auditing and meeting compliance needs, the Axiomatics Policy Auditor and the Axiomatics Review Manager, both of which Srijit will walk us through, including the benefits and walk through a use case as well. Okay? Okay, what is ABAC, or Attribute-Based Access Control? In essence, it is Externalized Authorization Management, or EAM. And this is the process of decoupling business logic or mission logic from your access control logic. The needs for this are many, but an easy way to envision this is imagining an enterprise with, say, 100 mission applications being developed, and you don't want access control solutions being developed for all 100 of those applications. In fact, you'd rather have your application developers working on mission code or business code or what they're being paid to do, and let the access control be done in a central location. This externalized authorization management pulls that access control out of these individual applications and puts them in a centralized location. We are moving authorization logic into a single point of management. Now, there are a few advantages to this. One of which is that you don't have 100 stovepipe solutions for access control, all of which require maintenance, all of which require need to know based on the individual application developers. When you pull all this access control information in a single point, it gives you advantages of being able to reuse policies, to build digital policy hierarchies, and provide you easy audit abilities as well. So we're seeing a large shift in the market, particularly in my space out here in the U.S. federal space, of going away from your role-based access control where you have to have thousands and thousands of role-based lists, very hard to maintain, very hard to audit, into more of a digital policy attribute-based access control model, which is what we're discussing today. This policy-driven authorization expresses logic as configurable policies rather than code. You don't have to embed any access control code into your application. These digital policies are all stored separately in the central repository. And we do use, I mentioned briefly the role-based attribute or access management. Certainly roles can be an attribute, but this is a much larger use of the word attribute, which is encompassing of roles as well. So when we're talking about attribute-based access control, we can be talking about attributes pertaining to a person, an identity, a non-person entity, or any other subject that is trying to access a resource. Anything that you can describe about that subject can be used in building a digital policy. And the other thing too is we approach our ABAC solutions by using standards. We use XACML, which is a XML-based access control language, and also Alpha, which is a Java C++-like language for converting code into XACML, which is the language that we use for communicating access control responses and decisions and policies with Intra and with other systems as well. Okay, next. So what are attributes about? Well, really what we're trying to do here is provide context. We're trying to provide context to who, what, when, where, why, and how. In the old model, you had a subject, John Smith, trying to perform read on a resource or an object. Let's say it's a data store. But that doesn't tell you a whole lot of information about what he's accessing, when he's accessing where. ABAC provides you the ability to add context. Who is trying to access the data? We have John Smith. What is he trying to access? Data store. When is he trying to access it? Are there times that you want to lock down the ability to access certain data? You certainly couldn't do that in the older ABAC model. Where is John Smith accessing this data from? What network is he from? What geographic location is he calling from? These may matter depending on your mission needs, your business needs, your enterprise needs. Why is he trying to access it? Is there a component in the governance process that is required for him to access his data? What kind of context is wrapped around the why of why someone's trying to access data at a certain time? And how, by what means, is this person trying to access data? Again, with the old ABAC model, you're very limited on contextual information surrounding the access request. Okay?
Yep.
So this is the basic ABAC reference architecture, and this is a very common diagram you may have seen before on the internet. What we're seeing here in the upper left-hand corner is the resource, or is the subject. So this is, for example, the John Smith. On the right-hand side, you are seeing the data that John Smith is trying to access, or the object, or the resource. In between there is a policy enforcement point. And this is the application, or gateway, or filter that is actually performing the decision, enforcing the decision as to whether the person can reach the data or not. So what we provide, what the ABAC reference architecture provides, is right below the policy enforcement point, you're going to see a policy decision point. This is the decision engine that actually returns a response, permit, deny, indeterminate, or other, to the policy enforcement point with a XACML response saying, yes or no, you cannot be permitted to data, or you can. Again, you're going to see a little box there with the XACML. The communication between the PEP and the PDP, the policy decision point, is in XACML. So when the resource, or when the subject, John Smith, makes a request for the data, the PEP says, okay, I've got information on John Smith. Here is his identifier. Let's say a distinguished name or a unique ID. He's trying to access this data XYZ. That request is taken by the PEP and sent to the policy decision point for an answer. Well, based on the digital policies that were created surrounding this access control request, the PDP first must gather information on John Smith. We have his ID. Let's go look him up in the policy information point and pull some relevant attributes back about this individual based, again, on the policies. So, for example, this may be an LDAP or a database or some other source of attributes on this individual. Our software also will look up the required policy, digital policy revolving around this request as well. The policy decision point takes this information, both the policy and the attributes, and based on the predefined policies that you've created, will return that decision to the policy enforcement point. So it is actually the policy enforcement point again. I want to reinforce enforcing the decisions that the PDP returns. Way at the bottom of this diagram, we also have what is called the policy administration point. And here is where you would have an administrator or perhaps a data owner logging in and actually managing or editing policies. Again, there are a number of different ways to put in digital policies into a system. Ultimately, we want to speak the language of XACML, so you're going to see all throughout this reference architecture how we're communicating back and forth in XACML. Okay?
Yep.
Okay, so how does Axiomatics do this? Well, we provide enterprise software for access control or externalized authorization management. And we do this by a number of different solutions. One is our authorization for application. So we have a solution we call APS, Axiomatics Policy Server, where we have that addresses the business logic and middleware, as well as the APIs and web services. So when you're looking at the N-tier stack of an architecture, we like to place our authorization for applications anywhere within the business logic, presentation layer, middleware, where requests that are being made to, say, an API gateway can be rerouted to our policy decision point, go fetch the attributes required, go fetch the policy required, and then return decisions to the applications. At the very bottom of the N-tier architecture, where you actually get to the data store, we also have authorization for databases. Exact same architecture as the reference architecture you saw previously, except this time we actually have a SQL filter, which will inject where clauses into the data store. So this is advantageous because you don't have to do post-filtering operations. You can simply have the SQL filter make a new SQL statement into the data store, and then only the information that the requester is permitted to see is actually removed from the data store. All sensitive information is still retained there in the database. So two solutions here that we offer, both for covering the effective range of the N-tier architecture. Okay.
Right. And Brian, the one thing I could add on there is that if you look at the vendors in the market for attribute-based access control, you see that typically you do have the authorization for applications where you get a permit or a deny, as Brian, you mentioned. It's always a yes or a no question, and you get back an answer yes or no. And that's typically enough for business logic and middleware, because a lot of this logic stays in the application as to what can be done with a permit or a deny. But the reason we moved it back to the databases itself is that typically, almost always, I guess, you would see that customers want to protect the data, which ultimately resides in database. So, and we saw that the need for a more kind of a generic solution for databases, and in a way, architecturally, what that means, if you go back to the diagram of ABAC, is that we moved the PEP, the policy enforcement point, as near to the database as possible, such that applications themselves don't really have to worry about whether there is an ABAC involved, whether there is some kind of a PEP install involved and a PDP install. It just normally talks to what it sees as a database, and it actively, we in the product side actively intercepts it and does the modification of the SQL, as you mentioned, Brian.
Excellent. Yes, thank you for throwing that in there as well.
Okay.
Okay, so if we go on to the next page, I believe what we're going to talk about next here is what we're hearing our customers say,
Mhm.
We need more audit and access review capability. And Srijit, with that, I will hand it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian. So, as Brian mentioned, we do have a broad coverage when it comes to serving the requirements from customers, be it from an application point of view, different tier part of the stack, or from the database point of view. And typically, that's what you would look at for the when you start into the ABAC world. What are the tiers that you can serve? But as you move into the space of ABAC, you will also, of course, need sooner or later more auditing capabilities, more capabilities around governance, more capabilities around access review. And that's what we heard from customers who have migrated most of their IAM infrastructure, or its authorization infrastructure and access control infrastructure, to ABAC. And we listen to our customers because customers are of top priority. And what we have done is made sure that our product line reflects the fact that there is the need for governance and overall through our kind of an access review and audit compliance requirement throughout the ABAC cycle. And as Brian mentioned in the agenda, what we're going to do in the next few slides is to give you an idea of the two big tools that we have: the Axiomatics Policy Auditor, which is the first tool, and then we will introduce a new tool, the Axiomatics Review Manager, which we introduced into the market a couple of weeks ago, that also serves a big purpose and meets a lot of requirements from customers from a production point of view. So Axiomatics Policy Auditor basically is used for writing a set of questions that you can run against the policies that you're developing to make sure that the policies that you're writing in language that is XACML, Externalized Access Control Market Language, reflect the IT or the governance compliance policies that you get from the businesses or compliance officers. So it's used to explore and analyze if there are gaps within the access control policies that you're writing during the authoring process. So typically what would happen in a process is you start writing your policies, you want to run a couple of tests against them to make sure that all the corner cases as well as the normal cases are covered, and the policy auditor is the perfect tool to do that. In fact, if you look at the features and the capabilities of the policy auditor, you'll see that there are some of the functionalities that it's very hard to find in the other products in the market. For example, one of the things you would see is that you can ask questions about negative conditions. Say, for example, you could say, let's say you have written a lot of policies around people accessing patient data, hospital nurses, doctors, and so on. And then you want to see what are the things that a nurse cannot do. So you have a negative condition there. What can somebody who is not a nurse do? Or what can a nurse not do with this record? And things like that. So it's a really hard problem if you look at it from a conceptual point of view. And we have, using the policy auditor, simplified that process to make it easier for customers to actually write these queries, run them against these policies they're developing, to make sure that when the policies are certified GA, it covers all these corner cases as well. So from a flow point of view, what you would see is that when you're writing your policies, you of course save it somewhere, and then you have this policy auditor run questions and queries against them, and you get a report that can then be vetted. In fact, we also support batch process mode, so you can write n number of queries or n number of questions or tests, and you get a kind of a good report at the end of it, which says X number of queries were passed, Y number of queries did not pass, and you can kind of see at every point in time whether everything is okay or not. So in this example, basically, I'm looking at to see what can a supplier who is within a company network do. So you can ask questions and you get back response from the APA, Axiomatics Policy Auditor, and there you can actually check to see whether it adheres to what's needed. So that's been a product that we have in the market for a while now, and a lot of our customers have been using it. But then this is geared mostly towards the process where you write your policies. It's not geared for different reasons as a tool that you would run against production level quality policies in real time. This is more of an analysis tool that's done an offline before the fact of deployment. So what we have seen from customers is that this is, while good, it doesn't cover the full life cycle of ABAC, which is also about what can you do when you have policies in production? How can you test against them as well? What can you say about policies that's involved there? And that's where the Axiomatics Review Manager comes into picture. Axiomatics Review Manager is a recently introduced product. It's one of the crown jewels of Axiomatics in the recent times. The need that comes from that we are trying to address here is the following. Let's consider an information security officer or compliance officer who whatnot, who wants to know if the policies that's in place in your organization in production are enforcing what it's actually supposed to be doing. So let's say that you have a policy about doctors, policy about nurses, and you want to make sure that every so often you can check and make sure that this exactly is what your IT policies dictate, or your compliance policies, be it any data retention laws and so on, dictates. Another kind of a use case is where you have a big organization where you have managers and subordinates, and managers want to sign off on access review reports that of subordinates. In my previous company, we had a similar scenario where the manager, my boss, had to sign off to say that, okay, Srijit and my colleagues X, Y, and Z has the necessary privileges to do certain things in the system, and not more and not less. So he had to do that, I think, once a quarter, once a half a year. And that's, again, one of those requirements you want to test the production policies on. And the last but not the least, you do have the case of application owners, the people who are completely and solely in charge of all things related to a specific application, the working of the application, the operational part, as well as the data and the access control in that application. So they also want to make sure that all the actions that can be performed by various kinds of users in the system, administrators, regular users, people logging in from various departments and so on, can do only those things that the application is expecting them to do, and nothing more and nothing less. So that's kind of the different kind of personas of people who would be interested in doing this kind of use cases, and the need that we have seen that in the market that the Axiomatics Review Manager is addressing. So let's dive a bit more deeper into Axiomatics Review Manager. So as mentioned before, foremost, it allows users to understand the effect of deployed policies. And that means that it is developed for a production environment. A couple of reasons, a couple of striking features about that is that, first of all, it works with the policies that you have deployed on your infrastructure. It uses all the information that Brian mentioned before about all the attribute sources that you have within your environment, be it LDAP directories, Active Directories, SQL databases, and any other web service kind of attribute sources. All these production level attribute sources can be consumed by the review manager infrastructure to give you up-to-date real-time access review reports. And of course, because you want to do it often, you want to make sure that it is template driven to produce tailored access review reports. So you want to be able to write queries which is generic from a templating point of view, but then you should be able to ask questions which are more specific. For example, and that's something I will show further in the slide, you would want to ask questions about roles. What can somebody with role blah blah do? And that dash needs to be filled when you're actually doing the running of the report. So the review manager is designed and implemented in such a way as to be able to reuse these templates, but then filled in the specific values as per the requirements of your access review at that point. And it can provide answers to common questions, common in terms of what is it that you want to expect to be asked about from compliance officers or information officers. For example, who can perform what action? Let's say who are the people who can read a specific patient's records, who are the people who can add on data into a specific patient's record. Or you can ask other combinations of these questions as well. A slightly different question would be, what can the doctor do with patient X's record? Or you could ask more generic question, what can a doctor do with any patient's data? So there are different kind of hierarchies of questions, different abstraction levels of questions, and Review Manager is supposed to be flexible enough, and it's designed to be flexible enough to cater to all these levels of abstraction. So you can drill deep into specific questions, and you can be high level as well, talking about roles, talking about locations, talking about specific records or resources, as Brian mentioned in the architecture. So overall, what we hope is that these reports help to prove compliance with regulatory requirements and enable periodic access review with internal stakeholders. So going back to the use cases, the compliance and regulatory requirements were driven by CISOs and the audit compliance officers' point of view, while the periodic access review from internal stakeholders are driven by managerial requirements or application owner requirements. So that's kind of the features that we will have, as you will see in the next slides to come, in the Review Manager. And as we proceed further in our improvement of Review Manager, you will see more of these features and more other features also coming into the slide to reflect the feedback we get from customers. All right, so we always love to do flow diagrams and kind of try and encompass all the different moving parts into that central picture that Brian mentioned about the ABAC reference architecture. We have simplified the reference architecture here a bit. We have removed certain parts of the architecture. For example, the repository point where the policies are stored. We don't really show it. We don't really show the administration point and so on. But what we show here is, the most importantly, the authorization service, the PDP part of the architecture, the attribute sources of the architecture, and the policies associated with the architecture and the actual deployment. And all these, just to remind you again, are production ready and in production deployments. So what the Review Manager would do is ask questions to this authorization service. To simply put, ask questions, slightly open-ended questions, because you're not going to ask, can Alice edit this record 123, because that's a very simple question. You get a yes or a no, but that's very hard to scale up because you may have hundreds of these records. So you would want to ask what we call open-ended questions. For example, in this case, what you're saying is, under what conditions can user A access data which is classified as sensitive? So that's a compliance requirement. You need to make sure that there are specific conditions that user A has to meet before he or she has access to sensitive data. And you want to make sure that these information is always up to date and never wrong. And what here we have as example is a policy which says users can view documents in their own department if their clearance is greater than the document's classification. So that's the simplest form of watermark level policies, or simplest form of need to know policies in a way. So what the Review Manager does internally is ask a question which basically gets you back a report which says, in this case, the document, and so user A can access sensitive data if the document department is R&D and the document classification is less than equal to secret. Now that report is generated because in this case, A belongs to R&D department, and the classification or the clearance of user A is secret. So Review Manager basically queries the authorization service, finds out all the conditions under which certain things can happen, and creates a report based on the dynamic information available in all the different attribute sources. If it's a bit confusing, don't worry, because we're going to drill a bit more deeper based on a very specific use case. Now, let's take a look at how that works when you start looking at Review Manager. The first thing to do would be to define the requirements for proving compliance. So what are these questions that you want to ask? And then the second thing to do, and we will go through each one of them with the use case. The second thing to do would be to create a report to capture those requirements. So you want to be able to create a report that you can fill in and ever so often ask and create reports against. The third, of course, will be to actually generate those reports for specific input values, Alice or A or role manager and so on and so forth. And the fourth and the most important thing, of course, would be to look at that report that you get and understand whether that actually is what you expect in your production environment. And our aim is to try and make it as simple for you to understand as possible and as thorough and consistent as possible, because without any of those three, it's really not a useful tool. So to go back to the previous point I mentioned, we will walk through this review manager use case with a very specific example. Let's say you have a company called Acme Inc. It's one of those very often used example scenarios of Acme Inc. as a company. Let's say there are 4 rules regarding access to some form of a record. Let's say rule 1 is a very simple rule. It's a very very static rule, which says that a manager can view all records irrespective of the department that the record belongs to. So it's a very simplified kind of check of equality conditions. And what you see on the right hand side of the slide is a rendition of the actual rendering rather of the actual rule as you would see when you're composing it on our services manager component of the policy server. So it's a very UI driven policy authoring tool. You basically here say that you're going to permit access if the question is about object type record, and the user role is manager, and the user is trying to do an action view. It's cut off because I couldn't expand it to show the whole attribute IDs. But the idea is if all these 3 conditions are met, it means rule 1 is met, and so you can permit that action. It's a relatively simple rule, easy to understand. And you will also know that if you have to ask questions about it, if this was the only rule, it's a very easy question. Oh, check whether Alice or Bob is manager. Yeah, then you can view all records. Simple. But now let's complicate the life a bit more, because life is never so simple. Rule 2 adds on to that and says that an employee, on the other hand, can view records belonging to his or her own department. Now, remember that a manager could view records irrespective of his or her department, while an employee has to be in the same department as the record. So when you write your policies, it becomes a bit more complex. You basically do very similar things as the equality for the manager, but in this case for the employee. So an employee can view a record, but then you have this extra conditions which we have kind of captured here, saying let's just ignore for the com.acme to make something simpler. It's just a namespace. So basically what you're saying is that the user department should be same as the record department. So you have that additional constraint, and that's where kind of things gets more interesting and more complex, and where the properties and the power of ABAC shines through. So you have that extra rule. Now you would now know that if you have to ask questions, you need to ask more interesting questions now. Let's complicate it a bit more. Rule 3, which says that an employee can edit the record that he or she owns if it's in the draft stage. So now we're talking about something more than viewing the record. We're talking about editing the record. In that case, you need to look at few more other things, conditions. An employee can edit the record if it's in the status of draft, status equal to draft, and also importantly, the employee should be the owner of that record. So the user.employee ID, whatever username you have, should be the same as the record.owner. So if there is an attribute called record owner, that person have to be the employee, and only then can you edit the actual record. hopefully that's giving you an idea of how more and more complex your policies can be. And I mean, to be frank, this is still very simple level 1 kind of ABAC policies. Let's push that one more further up and let's look at rule number 4. Here you have a rule which is interesting because now you're talking about a manager and can do an action called publish. So you can publish the record if first it's in the final stage, so no more draft stage, it has to be in a final stage, but also more importantly, that manager can only publish those records which are owned by his or her subordinates. So if you have a hierarchical structure and your manager's managing a couple of employees, he or she can only publish those records that is owned by these subordinate employees. So the way you would do that in our policy editing tool is basically similar things as view and edit. So instead of that, you do have a publish and you check question about whether it's final, and then you check to make sure that the owner of the record is also one of the subordinates of that user. So the user.subordinate should have the owner of the record as one element of what we call the set. So here you will see that all three rules taken on its own are generally relatively easy to understand and get your head around. But when you bring all these 3-4 rules together, especially the fourth and the third rule, things can get really complex, and add into that mix the fact that people's departments might change, the status of these records might change, the role of the users might change. It gets really interesting to know exactly what is allowed and what's not allowed for at any point in time in production level systems or production systems. And that's where Review Manager would come into picture. So let's take a look at questions that are of interest in this use case. One of them could be, what are the actions that a manager can do on any record, not a record 1, 2, 3, just any record. What can a manager do? What are the actions that can be performed by an employee instead of a manager on an employee? But you could also ask targeted questions. For example, what can a user Alice do on any record? So you don't really know the role of Alice at any point in time because it could change. All you know is that username is Alice. Or you could ask a question around the resource. You could basically ask, say, what actions can be performed, or what are the conditions, or what are the actions that can be performed on record 1, 2, 3 with an ID 1, 2, 3. So these are all questions that are of interest for anybody who wants to know what's going to happen in the system at any point in time. Let's take a look at one specific example and walk through it as again. So let's say that you are interested in knowing what would be possible for an employee to view. Oh, sorry. Let me phrase that more clearly. It should be possible. So you're trying to make sure this holds true. It should be possible for employees to view records in their own department. So it should be possible, and that's the only thing they should be able to see as well. So the first thing you would do is create a template which says the role of the user is kind of given. It's to be filled. And what you want to understand, in this case, the response, is about resource attributes and action. So what can be done for resource and what are the different actions that can be done. And the third thing, of course, is to request a specific report, in this case by filling employee as the role, and you get back the response. And what would that report look like? Well, let's see. So the first things first, you're going to take a look at the demo with slides. I'm not going to try my luck with the live demo, even though I have full faith in my engineering team. Let's take a look at the template that's created. So you start off with a template. In this case, I have 4 templates, which you see on the left-hand side. So, and the one that I have highlighted is the one specific to this example. So here I have created a template where I'm going to ask questions about the role. What can a user with role dash do? So that's a very simple question, but it's a very interesting question because you could ask questions about a user who is an employee, who is a manager, or who could be CEO, CTO, break the glass ceiling kind of policies, and so on. And then you also see that there are a few other templates on the left-hand side, and that's about other aspects of the questions you can ask, about a specific user ID, about a specific record, 1, 2, 3, or a combination, in fact, even user ID and a record. So those are all the different kinds of templates you can write. In this case, I'm just looking at one specific one, which is about the role of a user. So we start off with creating these templates. In the Review Manager, there's a section where you can upload these templates by the administrator. So the administrator one-off creates these templates, and then any point in time, a user can then log in, look at all the templates available, and start running access review reports against them. So let's see what that entails, what it means to actually create a report. It's as simple as, in this case, adding the specific value of the role that you have. In this case, you want to understand what can a user with the role employee do. So you enter enter that information into that template and click the generate report button. And that itself would be more than enough to create the report. You don't need to do anything more because all the other information can be pre-populated in the template. For example, here, when you're writing these policies, you know that the policies are about something called records, object type called records. But then you don't see that in the template because these are things which the user doesn't really have to be bothered about. So they are hidden from the user who is creating the report, but it actually is specified in the background. So the template schema is rich enough for us to be able to provide more than enough information to the user, and if not needed by the user to make any decision, you can hide the information as well. You can also, in this case, you would be interested to know that there is a button called add input, which means you could theoretically talk about a user with multiple roles, employee and a manager role, and you could ask questions about that as well. So in this case, I'm going to just talk about an employee role, and you will get back an output which is similar to this. Now, it looks like it's very heavy, but it's very, very simple if you look at it from two specific inputs point of view. It talks about two separate set of conditions. The first one talks about, so the question you asked, again, the report that's generated first gives you an idea what exactly is the question you asked, so you're not kind of blindsided, cited about what is the question you asked, because if you want to print it, you wouldn't be able to print the previous question you asked, so it's repeated again. And then basically what it says is that if you are an employee, the following combinations will give you access, so you can do these things. First one, view the action. If he can basically do anything to do with view on a record as long as the user department is the same as the record department. Now, if you remember, that is actually rule number 1. Sorry about that. So that is rule number 1. Rule number 2. The rule number 2 basically stating that if you are an employee, you should be able to view all the information about a record as long as the record belongs to your department. And while the next one is about an action called edit. And what we are saying is that if you're an employee, you can edit a record as long as it's in the draft stage and the employee are the owner of that record. Now, if you remember, that's actually about rule 3, because rule 2 and rule 3 was about employees. And this report basically churns out all this information and gives you the output and says, this is exactly what you would be able to do as an employee. Now, if you look at rule number 2's output, this is exactly what you were trying to prove. If you remember, it said that it should be possible for employees to view records in their own department. And the output of that report basically confirms that an employee can view records as long as the employee department is the same as the record department. Now, this is kind of a simpler question you could ask. You could ask questions specific to Alice in this case, or Bob. If Alice is an employee, you would see that this would go out and fetch information which is more specific about that user. Instead of saying the user.department is a record department, you could basically will get an output which says R&D department equals record.department because Alice belongs to division R&D and so on. But here in this example, it's a very generic question because I wanted to give you an idea how generic as well as how specific the questions can be about. And this gives you an idea of what the review manager would do right now. So I think we are approaching the hour. So let me just quickly wrap up the webinar and kind of explain how we see these two products, the Axiomatics Policy Auditor and the Axiomatics Review Manager, adding on to the repository of all the repertoire in a way of all the different products that we have, enabling you to do access control reviews and authorization governance throughout the ABAC lifecycle. So as Brian mentioned first, we have the authorization for applications as before. Now we have authorization for database as before as well. And now added to that mix, we have these two policies which allows you to do audit compliance reviews and access reviews, making it easier for you to proceed in your ABAC lifecycle. So that's kind of the end of the webinar presentation content as such. So if you have any extra questions that you have about the review manager, about the approach we have taken, we'll be more than happy to answer those. As Kelly mentioned, please use the box on the control panel to ask your questions, and we will read out the questions and answer them as much as possible.
Srijit, this is Brian again.
Hi, Brian.
Before we get the questions in, I just wanted to make a comment.
Sure.
It seems like you can never have a 100% secured system. Otherwise, a lot of security IT companies would be out of business.
Sure thing.
But it seems to me that the combination of the policy auditor and the review manager, that you can really reduce risk in your system security, and knowing that a certain subject cannot or can read a resource. So you can define things that you definitely know or definitely someone definitely cannot do within your system. So at least when the access control realm, these two tools really help you to clarify the access control policies that you're, and make sure that they mirror your organization or your enterprises or your agencies' policies, right?
That's right. Because, I mean, especially for people who come from the role-based access control model of the world, people have had a good grasp of doing these reviews and audits, just because things were a bit more static there. You have permissions associated with roles, and you assign groups to, users to these roles. So it's a bit more of a static world, so you can do analysis on it. While for the ABAC world, as often people say, with great powers comes great responsibility. You have a lot of power in terms of what you can express, complex policies as well as simple policies, and you can cater to ever-moving landscape of requirements from HR and so on. So you need to be able to come up with a system which combines the power but then still provide governance as well. And exactly as you mentioned, Brian, it helps you reduce the risk as an overall deployment scenario.
Okay, very good. Thank you. We do have a question in. I will ask you this.
Sure.
Is the review manager functionality part of the XACML standard?
That's an interesting question. So, so the way we see it is that XACML is a core standard that we look at from a point of view of it's a bread and butter standard for us. We believe in the power of XACML, but we also believe in pushing the envelope and pushing the edge around these standards. So the review manager looks at XACML policies. So it actually analyzes XACML policies, but the functionality of the review manager is actually beyond the XACML standard. It goes beyond that because XACML standard talks about a yes or no decision questions, while here you ask open-ended questions. So what can Alice do? And that's an open-ended question. You're not asking whether it's a permitted or deny question. So in short, we work on XACML 3.0 policies, but we actually innovate around the edges of the standard. So that's where I think is the value add that we as a company and Axiomatics Review Manager as a product bring into the picture.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. We had previously talked about APS being a authorization service for applications, and we also made reference to the authorization for databases, although I don't think we actually used the acronym that we use for that, the ADAF data filter, data access filter. So a question, I just wanted everyone to hear that acronym being used, ADAF. So the question I got next is, can Review Manager be used with both APS and ADAF, so both the authorization for application and authorization for databases deployment?
Right, yep. And the short answer is yes, you can. Because both of these solutions, the Axiomatics Policy Server, which works at the business logic and the other tiers of your application, and the database product called ADAF, Axiomatics Data Access Filter for databases, they all still work at the XACML policy level. And that's I said, it's where we actually ground ourselves and we say that everything that we do is based around the standard. And because both these products work at the same standard, you write your policies in the XACML standard. So the review manager can look into these policies. So in the extrapolation of the working, basically it boils down to the fact that review manager can work and ask and answer questions about the policies you use for the application level access control, as well as the data level access control.
Okay, very good. This next question is referring to the Review Manager, the Axiomatics Review Manager, ARM. This is a really cool set of features for the version 1.0 release. What else do you have coming in the pipeline?
Okay. It's one of the questions I was hoping I'll get, because with my product manager hat on, it's one of the things I'm looking forward to as well. So as you have seen, this is version 1.0 for people who may not know it. We just released it about a couple of weeks ago. So we are basically have a good pipeline of features that we want to implement in very short time frame to push the feature set into the review manager. First and foremost, of course, we are looking for feedback from customers. We have engaged a lot of our customers in the proof of concept and the beta stages as well. So a lot of the features you see here are the higher most features you wanted from the customer point of view. But we have a lot more coming in. For example, one of the things that people are interested in doing is to be able to do batch processing of queries. So you have, say, questions about Alice, Bob, Charlie, and so on, and you don't want to be able to write it one by one. So you want to do a batch mode processing of this generation of reports. That's one thing that's coming. And the obvious thing that we will keep improving on, and that's a kind of a moving target in a way, is to be able to provide simplified output from the report generation process. I mean, I'll be the first to admit that the output that you see right now, it's still a bit technical, and there's a lot we can do to simplify it. We have already in development simplified it to a more natural language level output. So that's one thing that we're going to hit and come out with. There are other things around connecting to all the attribute sources and being able to output information from a listing point of view. Let's say you have an output which said Alice can view all records which are less than or equal to the clearance secret. Well, that's a good thing to know, but this next question, obvious question, would be, what are these records? Which are the records which are less than equal to secret? So you want to have what we call an internal listing view. Yeah. So those are the things we have in plan, Brian.
Oh, that sounds good. Hey, we do have another question here too. I just came in. Does the policy information point, the PIP, support a specific list of data sources, or could we plug in any generic data source?
Right. So in the standard itself, it's generic. You don't really have a list of attributes authoritative list of attributes. Out of the box, we support LDAP queries. So we already have out of the box support for writing LDAP queries and getting outputs. SQL queries, so all the information you have in databases. Those are the two main things that we support out of the box. But most importantly, we have what we call the software development kits, SDKs, that you can use for writing your own PIP connectors. So a lot of our customers have data sources which are web service data sources, web services talking about all sorts of things, and they want to be able to query that web service sources. And the customers have basically used the SDKs to query them, connect to them, and ask these questions about roles and whatnot. So yes, we can have a generic data source as long as you are okay with creating that connector specific to your requirements. And it's not a heavy duty work to do. You should be able to get up and running in about a day max.
Okay, very good. That was our last question.
Great. So, so I guess hopefully you guys have had a good idea of what the Review Manager does and where we are headed and all the different things that we have in the product right now, the kind of use cases that we do have in mind for customers to be able to use the Review Manager. If you have more questions, if you have more suggestions, please feel free to contact us. I'm more than happy to. In fact, we are looking forward to hearing from our customers and prospects and anybody else interested in the field of ABAC and what we can do with this product. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. Till next time.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.